Thank you. So this research project is about regulation, but it's not about competition. So hopefully it's useful to some of you as you think about regulating online platforms. So the paper focuses on occupational licensing, which is actually pretty common in the US. It's a set of regulation that imposes restrictions on who can provide particular services. So, for example, lawyers, of whom we have many in the room, they have to pass exams before being able, like the bar exam in the US, before being able to practice law. Doctors have to do have similar requirements, but also plumbers and electricians and sometimes hair braiders have to abide by certain rules to provide their services. As of 2008, actually 30% of the workers in the US were in licensed occupation. And this was a really large number, especially if we compare it with the number of workers who are in unions in the US. Of course, as I mentioned, all states license doctors, lawyers, teachers, and barbers. And sometimes barbers' licensing hours are even more than police training. And you have even regulation of fortune tellers, frog farmers, auctioneers, and interior designers. On one hand, you have proponents who claim that occupational licensing ensures minimum quality levels. And so in a world where consumers don't know the quality of service providers before engaging in a transaction, guaranteeing these minimum standards of quality actually allow consumers to trust service providers and ultimately engage in the transactions themselves. Opponents, though, claim that licensing restricts competition and might lead to increased prices. And if we have price-sensitive consumers, that might be a cost to consumer welfare. Of course, proponents of licensing tend to be already in the profession. They sort of are those who cross the door and want to close it behind themselves. There's on a political level, there's some opposition to licensing on both sides of the political spectrum. Actually, currently, the Trump Department of Labor is actually working to reduce some requirements of licensing. And Obama's Council of Economic Advisors did a study sort of showing the costs of occupational licensing regulation, one of the biggest costs being reduced mobility of the workers subject to licensing regulation. And of course, we have theory models. We have many theory models, the most important of whom is Shapiro, that says that licensing is not needed in a world where we have functioning reputation systems that potentially can substitute for the regulation. So online platforms are actually, and we've talked about them a lot today, are becoming the primary, and yesterday, are becoming the primary way of finding professionals in many industries. And I would argue that there are two benefits, actually, from having online platforms. The first is that by tracking transactions and having online reviews, they can potentially make some licensing requirements less necessary. And I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, oh my gosh, but online reviews are totally biased. They are subject to manipulation. Some of them may even be fake. There's also quite a wide literature highlighting the discriminatory power of regulators. Sometimes regulators have sort of limited resources. They cannot monitor service providers on a timely basis. So there's sort of costs and benefits on either side of the spectrum. The second benefit is that actually they provide a new way, online platforms, by tracking so much information about the consumer's transactions with service providers, they provide a new way to measure the effects of licensing, which we didn't have before. The literature, actually, the empirical literature is extremely scant. And so we're going to ask in this project a couple of research questions. The first one is whether consumers care about knowing that a professional is licensed. This is a very positive description of the reality, is that do consumers care whether a professional is licensed, and do licensed professionals can licensed professionals sort of be hired at a higher rate? The result is that positive reviews and low prices matter a lot more than knowing whether a professional is licensed or not. At the same time, this is just showing the signaling value of occupational licensing. So it might be that consumers just trust that both the regulation and the level of enforcement just guarantee that everybody is providing a high enough level of quality. And so we're really interested in studying how equilibrium outcomes, namely competition and prices, change as the licensing regimes becomes less or more stringent. And so what we find is that more stringent licensing regimes lead on average to less competition and higher prices, so fewer professionals are actually bidding for home improvement jobs in our context. And we have no detectable effect on what we can measure of customer satisfaction. And I should be very clear that what we can measure of customer satisfaction is sort of what the customer sees and what the customer sees in sort of in the short term. So the regulator might be interested in dimensions of quality that the consumer cannot see and that we cannot capture in this study. Okay. So let me describe the setting. The setting from which we get data is an online platform for home improvement services. So the platform wants to remain anonymous, but I can easily describe it. If you need a plumber or need an electrician, you can actually go on this platform, post these requests, and some professionals in those disciplines can bid for your job. And by the way, this platform is really large in the US. It's only US-based. And it has national reach and millions of transactions across many home improvement categories. As I mentioned, the consumer is going to post a detailed job request, and providers are going to pay to submit a quote. So providers receive my request for an electrician, and certain electricians are going to decide to submit bids with information on the price and their availability to each and every request. And the number of bids is capped to a number between 5 and 6, so that every bid is sort of seriously considered by the customer. The customer can choose to hire a pro. It's not a procurement auction in which the lowest bid is automatically accepted. The customer is going to be able to choose a pro, and they can actually choose not to hire anybody. And so the information that the customer sees is, if the 4 co-authors in this paper were sort of professional on this platform, you would see information about their number of reviews, the average rating, the quoted price, and importantly, you would see if the professional has submitted their licensing information to the platform. Why do I say has submitted their licensing information to the platform? Because the information about occupational licensing is absolutely voluntary on this platform. So a professional can decide to submit this information to the online marketplace. The marketplace is going to take some variable time, which is between a day and a few weeks, to verify that that licensing information is authentic. And once that licensing information is verified, that badge that I showed you before sort of appears on the platform. So conditional on submitting information about the license, the time at which consumers start seeing that I'm licensed is random from the point of view of the service provider. Okay, but plumbing is one of the categories where most states actually require licensing. Still, the licensing requirements vary across states, which we're actually going to use in the cross-state analysis. There's also other occupations where licensing regulation is a little bit more blurred. So let me give you a couple of examples. One is sort of painting. So painting in California, for example, for jobs above $500, you need to be licensed. For jobs below $500, you don't need to be licensed. Interior designers in Florida, they need to be licensed. But you can call yourself interior decorator, and you don't need to be licensed. And so because of that reason, actually, the platform does not require anybody to be licensed and does not require anybody to provide their licensing information. They're purely a sort of a match, not even a matchmaker. They are just transferring information between the two sides. The most common licenses in home services are the one that we're sort of most familiar with: contractors, plumbers, electricians, home inspectors, pest controls, and pesticide applicators and mold assessors. We have data from this platform for an 8-month period in 2015, many different service categories, and we have the data at the bid level. Let me speed up, because I think I only have 10 minutes left. But let me speed up and show you the main idea of our empirical analysis. So to the extent that the time in which when the license appears on the website is random, we can compare the probability that a professional is hired before and after that event. It's sort of an event study approach. And we can do this both for the time when the license is validated and when the first review is submitted, to see how much more important reviews are relative to the license being validated. So if the license had any effect, we would see sort of a discrete jump upward in the probability of being hired after this red line. What we see is sort of a flat or non-monotone change in the probability of being hired. And the point estimate is actually extremely small as well. Now, it is possible that the probability of being hired doesn't change because professionals, as soon as they are licensed on the website, actually start increasing their bids. Yeah, so I don't have the summary statistics in this short presentation, but there's of course a very skewed distribution where there's a few professionals who have hundreds of reviews, and there's many professionals with very little reviews. Because we use the first review, we actually have quite a large number of professionals who get reviewed and are in the data set. But absolutely, to the extent that the more reviews you have, the more accurate, hopefully, the signal of quality is. So the professionals cannot delete reviews from the website because it's an independent platform. They can certainly ask a consumer to please rate me. But at that point, the review is out of their control. But absolutely, I should acknowledge that, review manipulation and review fraud is sort of a hot topic. What I would argue is that platforms, because they need to attract both sides of the marketplace, they have an interest in having as good a review as system as possible. Okay, so the higher rate doesn't change around license validation, and that's not because the service professional charge dramatically higher prices after the license is validated. So there's no supply response. On the other hand, we see that the probability of being hired substantially changes after the first review, and this is actually just the effect of the first review, but we can do it for more reviews, and the effect still holds. And again, it's not because they dramatically decrease the prices after they receive the first review. Now, we can actually verify this event study approach in choice regressions. I'm not going to show you the details of the choice regressions, but what we find in the choice regression, again, is that the ratings are much more important than the license being validated, and most importantly is that consumers are extremely price sensitive. So to the extent that licensing regulation increases prices, we should be worried about consumer welfare. Okay, so the results so far suggest that consumer choices don't depend on seeing whether a pro is licensed. This might be due to the professional actually telling consumers that they are licensed in any other way, particularly, for example, on the website or via messages. That doesn't seem to be the case. The license is mentioned on the professionals' profiles only 10% of the time. Consumers might not even think or know about the professionals' licensing status. And so we ran a nationally representative surveys with 5,000 respondents to really try and assess what consumers know and think about occupational licensing regulation. And this was quite telling. First of all, because a lot of people actually look for professionals online. 22% use a platform like the ones in our study, and if you include the 19% of people who search professionals via Google, actually this becomes almost as large as the people who find a professional through friends, which is still the largest category. I was surprised there's still people using Yellow Pages. Why do they choose professionals? When consumers sort of list the main reasons why they choose professionals, licensing basically never appears. They typically mention price, reviews, quality, cost, and recommendations, whether or not they've used an online platform to find a professional or not. The consumers typically know whether the professional is licensed, but that information doesn't come in the search stage. It typically comes when they sign the contract. So the majority of people find out that the professional is licensed because it's written in the contract that they end up signing, not because they've done the verification themselves. The other big category is because the professional told them. And then, do consumers even know if the license is required by law? 60% of them say that they know the license is required by law, but a large majority still says, a large chunk of the population still says they're not sure. But at the same time, when you ask consumers whether they are in favor of occupational licensing regulation, they say yes, they are absolutely in favor. And so it might be that consumers just assume that all professionals follow the state and occupation regulation, and the enforcement is enough to guarantee sort of the standards of quality that the consumers need. And so that's why sort of we move to looking at aggregate outcomes and explore the variation across occupations and across states in the level of licensing stringency for the particular occupational license requirements. And so we're really going to sort of measure the effect of licensing stringency on a bunch of outcomes of interest. What are the outcomes of interest? So I mentioned to you that sort of requests receive quotes. So we can look at sort of the search stage, how many quotes are received in states and occupations where licensing stringency is, where licensing is more stringent than states and occupations where licensing is less stringent. The quoted price to see whether this quoted price is bigger or lower. And then we can look at the same sort of outcome variables at the matching stage. So the probability of being matched, is it as easy or hard or harder to find a professional in states where the licensing stringency is higher? What is the price that I end up paying? And then customer satisfaction metrics. And again, I mentioned to you sort of the customer satisfaction metrics that we measure are really short-term and based on what the customer sees. So the probability of leaving a 5-star review out of all transactions and the probability of returning again to the platform, which other researchers have shown is sort of correlates with satisfaction with a particular service provider. So they have access to the same type of information that the customer submits. The platform does a pretty good job of asking pretty detailed questions about what the job entails. So there's sometimes like 30 or 40 questions, and we actually control for the task details in our specifications. It is possible, though, that sometimes the consumer doesn't really know what they need, and so that requires a little bit of a back and forth between the professionals and the service providers. I would argue that, though, remains the same across all the bids that are received for that particular task, in the sense that the information that the professionals have access to is the same the moment they send the bid. Yeah, so the different quotes can come from all sorts of different reasons. Differences in quality, like we exactly understood the same job, but we have different qualities. Or I think you only have one wall to paint, and you think that you have a whole house to paint. I think, to the extent that that's 3 minutes, sorry, yes, to the extent that that stays sort of constant across the different tasks or across the different states and occupations, then that's okay, because we capture sort of occupation fixed effects and state fixed effects. Okay, so what is our proxy for licensing stringency? It's a one-dimensional measure of licensing stringency. We codify publicly available licensing requirements. We take advantage of the Institute for Justice, which collects sort of the fees, the exams, the minimum grade, age, education, and experience for many of the occupations that we include in our work, and we hand collect data on a bunch of other professions that are not included in the Institute for Justice database, and we derive a one-dimensional score via principal component analysis. And we exclude state and occupations that don't have state regulation, mostly because sometimes some of these states have actually county-level regulation, and that would become very hard to collect. So what we find at the baseline, is that one standard deviation change in licensing stringency reduces the number of quotes by 2.4%. Now, this is not statistically significant in the sort of baseline specification. We can actually do a machine learning approach to sort of flexibly take into account for these sort of task characteristics that the customer posts when posting the request, and that becomes significant. We have a one standard deviation increase in the licensing stringency increases the price by 2 percentage points. Again, not huge numbers, but to the extent that we have price-sensitive consumers, we should take that into account when deciding the optimal policy. No effect on the probability of matching, but still the increase in the transacted price stays the same, and no effect whatsoever on the customer satisfaction matrix. And so because I had 3 minutes 5 minutes ago, I'm completely out of time. But again, we can account for all sorts of task characteristics that the customer posts, same results as the fixed effect regressions. And so back to my sort of initial conclusion, initial results, what we find is that reviews and prices, at least from the consumer's perspective, are more important than knowing whether a professional is licensed. And exploiting variation across states and occupations, we find that licensing leads to some extent to less competition and higher prices. Thank you.